My name is Kevin. I'm one of the pastors around here. Do this with me. Let's pretend for a moment that we're parents. And if you are a parent, it'll be easy for you. But pretend like you bought an Xbox One for your child, and you bring it home and you give it to your kid, and they are ecstatic. I mean, they are just like losing their mind, and they just shower with you loves and hugs and thank yous because they're so overjoyed with the gift that you've given them, and they set it up and they begin to play it and they love it, and you derive such a joy from watching the pleasure this gift brings your child. But as the days turn into weeks, this Xbox is all they want to do and play, and it becomes a bit of a tension in your relationship with your child. In fact, one day you get home from work, and you can't wait to just hang out with your kid and spend some quality time. But they do not want to hang out with you because they're busy with their Xbox. In fact, they're almost like offended that you would even suggest interrupting their time with their Xbox. What has happened? The gift has replaced the giver. Though that child would not articulate it this way, essentially, very practically speaking, the gift has become more important than the person who gave it to them. This is what we want to talk about today as we look at this topic of idols, one of the most talked about subjects in all of Scripture that we rarely really dig into. We kind of glaze over it and skip over it because we think that's like Indiana Jones kind of stuff, like that's for primitive people and primitive religions. It doesn't affect us. But the truth is, God has given us many, many, many good gifts, and He wants us to derive pleasure in life and have fun. Like, that's not something we figured out. Like, He created us, and we figured out how to have fun. Like, that was part of His whole plan for our lives. But if we aren't careful, the very good gifts that God gives us can become like almost a competition with God. Like almost like little gods themselves, like idols that get in the way of our relationship with God. And the real problem with them is that they are some of the hardest things to really diagnose and to deal with in our life. In fact, listen to these words from preacher man John Piper talking about this topic. He said, "The greatest enemy of God is not poison, but apple pie. It's not the banquet of the wicked that dulls our appetite for the banquet of heaven, but the endless nibbling at the table of the world. It's not the X-rated video, but the prime-time dribble of triviality we drink in every night. The greatest adversary of the love of God is not His enemy, but His gifts. The most deadly appetites are not for the poison of evil, but for the simple pleasures of earth. For when these replace an appetite for God Himself, the idolatry is scarcely recognizable. These are not evil in themselves. These are not vices. These are gifts of God. They are your basic meat and potatoes, coffee and gardening, reading and decorating, traveling and investing, TV watching and internet surfing, shopping and exercising, collecting and talking, and all of them can become deadly substitutes of God. You see why these idols of pleasure can be so dangerous in our lives. Something that we've got to just kind of talk about. Now, if you missed last week, we just looked at 2 verses at the end of a book called Joshua about the life of a man named Joshua, and they were words spoken by him where he challenged the people of God to choose. And what we talked about was so foundational today, so if you missed it, you got to go back, watch the video on YouTube or listen to the podcast. But basically what we talked about was that we are all worshipers, all of us, made to worship, and we all worship, no matter your background, through all human history, every civilization, atheist, faith-based, whatever it is, everybody's made to worship. We give our attention and our priority and our worship to something or to someone or many somethings and someones. And so without realizing that, sometimes we don't realize that this idolatry stuff is kind of a big deal. In fact, part of the problem for us as we're honest about this and look at this topic and why we kind of tend to skip over it in Scripture is that we are modern Western people. We don't bow before graven images. And we compartmentalize our life. We think of spiritual things like this. Right now, we sang some spiritual songs. We're going to talk about some spiritual stuff. We're going to have some spiritual thoughts. And then we're going to move on to the next part of our life, like home time, football time, family time, yard time. Tomorrow, you'll wake up and go have work time, and then there's dinner time. And we compartmentalize all that stuff, and we don't see it all as spiritual. But as you grow in understanding how God created you and the relationship He invites you into, as you mature in your relationship with Christ, it's about learning to come to understand that everything is spiritual. Every breath we breathe is a gift from God. Every day we wake up, we get to go use our time and our talents to serve God and use what He's given us to make this world a better place. Everything is worship, not just these overtly spiritual moments at the church. And so we talked about that last week and how important it is for us to kind of wrestle with this. And then we told you at the end a very interesting thing about God as it pertains to idolatry, that He is a jealous God. And how that kind of sounds like an unhealthy, possessive thing as we understand it. But if you learn to understand what God means in regards to jealousy, what He means is He doesn't share. We know that in marriage it does not work if you date other people. It breaks apart. And worshiping other idols doesn't work when you realize that you were made in the image of a creator. That's the understanding. And so kind of what we said is that until God alone sits on the throne of your heart, you and I will continue to have some of these struggles and these issues in our life. And it's like in the words of the great theologian Carrie Underwood, until Jesus takes the wheel, like whatever analogy works for you, we need God in control and priority of our life. And so today what we're going to do is jump hundreds of years in the people of God, from the book of Joshua to a story that lands in 1 Kings 17 and 18. And I love this story, but back hundreds of years before, Joshua had challenged the people of God to choose. He said, look, if serving the Lord is not desirable to you, then just choose this day, choose. But the people didn't want to choose. They wanted both. And so while they said, yeah, we choose God, what they did with those idols and distractions in life is they kind of just threw them in their closet and kept them around for like a plan B. And instead of destroying them, these things found their way back into their lives and into the spiritual rhythms of the people of God. And what I love about the scripture is this is not just a story of what happened to them, but it is our story. This is the pattern of our life that should sound somewhat familiar. We choose, but it's kind of half-hearted. We keep things around. They have a way of finding their way back in. Maybe for you felt like you needed to break off a relationship, but you kept their number in your contacts just in case. Or you keep telling yourself you're going to get out of debt, but you don't cut up the credit cards just in case. Or you've really focused on fitness, but you never threw out those fat pants just in case it didn't work out. Like we love to just kind of half-hearted take steps, and God's inviting us to choose and to put Him at the center of our life and prioritize Him with our attention, our priorities. And He promises that everything else will fall into place. But we don't even realize how much of our attention and worship we give to other things. So we're going to walk through this story, and I want to give you what I see is kind of like 4 steps from this story that will help us kind of smash these idols of pleasure in our life, that they would never become, these Xboxes, these good gifts, they would never become like little gods in our lives. And so here's the first step. The first step is for you and I to recognize the warning signs. And here's how the story reads. God sends a bad mamma jamma of a man named Elijah to the then king of Israel. And this is what Elijah shows up and says, verse 1, chapter 17. As the Lord, the God of Israel lives, whom I serve, there will be neither dew nor rain in the next few years except at my word. Now, to an agricultural people, this is incredibly detrimental. This is what sustains them, what feeds them. I mean, this is incredibly vital to who they are as the people of God. But what's interesting is that the primary God that they had begun to worship instead of the God of Israel was a God named Baal, and Baal was the God of rain. This was them trying to play both sides of the fence. They're like, hey, we trust God, you're totally in charge, but just in case this Baal thing's legit, and since He's in charge of the rain, let's worship Him too. God wasn't having it, and so what God was saying is, look, if you want to share my affection, I will remove my hand of blessing from your life. I'll stop the rain as the one who's really in charge. And it's kind of like Elijah is trying to say to them, what he's really saying to us is, hey, maybe the thing in our life that scares us the most or causes us the most frustration is because we have placed far too much importance upon it. In fact, we might be looking at that thing almost in divine terms to be something that only God can. As you think about those areas of your life that are frustrating, perhaps God's trying to get your attention. Perhaps that's a warning sign that we just need to recognize. It's like Elijah was saying, look, don't be surprised if you prioritize your marriage over God, if that becomes a source of frustration in your life. Don't be surprised if you prioritize your finances or your work or your career or your sex life or your happiness, of your desire and sense for security. If you prioritize that over God, don't be surprised if that becomes where you experience the most frustration in your life. And perhaps that is God trying to get your attention, like a warning sign, inviting you back into relationship. It's like Elijah is asking us, hey, what's your Baal? What's the thing that you really put a lot of stock in? It's like, yes, God, but also I really need this to work out. I really need that to work out. I really need this relationship. I really need my 401k and my stock options to do this. What are those things that might very well be getting in the way? They're a good gift. There's nothing wrong with them. But they could be getting in the way of the giver of those gifts. And so what happens in the story as it begins to unfold through the rest of 17 and into chapter 18 is that years pass and no rain falls. God makes his point, and then he sends Elijah back to the king of Israel. And Elijah comes and sets up like a God cage match. Like the God of gods versus all the gods of Baal. Like two gods will enter, one God will leave. This awesome moment. And this is how it reads in verse 19. Elijah says, now summon the people from all over Israel to meet me on Mount Carmel. And bring the 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of Asherah who eat at Jezebel's table. Like, let's have a throwdown. And so everybody gathers now on Mount Carmel, and there's all these prophets and all these people of nobility, and then everybody else would have been like spectating. Like, this is an exciting thing, like game day in Ann Arbor. Everybody's going to show up for what's about to go down. And verse 21, Elijah went before the people and said, how long will you waver between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal is God, follow him. But the people said nothing. Eerily similar to what Joshua was saying hundreds of years earlier last week to us. Choose. Just choose. You can't choose not to choose. That's your choice. You can't serve two masters. You can't play both sides. Just choose who it is. And as you align your life with that, everything else can work out. But we, like them, we want both. We say nothing. We sit silently. We want it all because we're so easily distracted. It's so hard to really trust. I think this leads us to the second step if we're going to kind of smash these idols of pleasure in our lives, and it's recognize the warning signs where God's getting your attention, but then leads us to this step, which is to restrain your spiritual ADD. Okay, all of us have an attention deficit disorder, spiritually speaking. And it's a tension every one of us must manage today and every day until the end of our lives. This is not a one-time check-a-box kind of a decision that you believe in God and trust him. It's a daily response and a daily choice. It's not a one-time clean out your closet, but a continual process of keeping God the priority of your life. We don't want to make a choice, but God forces us to. He calls us to. And he says, trying not to choose is still your choice. So realizing this kind of spiritual ADD, this how our hearts are just prone to wander, God's inviting us to see that our hearts really have a throne. And if you grew up in church like I did, we are famous for saying things that make no sense to people who didn't grow up in church, like the throne of our hearts. Like if I grew up in church, we call it Christianese. We grew up in church and like people would pray things like a hedge of protection. And you're like, you're praying for bushes in front of you? Like what? No one even has a hedge anymore. Or like people play like the blood of Jesus on stuff and you're like, that is weird sounding. Like I don't want blood on that. Like that's weird. The throne of our heart is like that, but it's a powerful analogy of understanding that our hearts were made with like a God-sized throne and he's the only one that can sit on it. But if we put other things there, they can't deliver on what we hope. When we give them our attention and our hopes, they just can't do what only God can do. In fact, we like to think of it not as a throne. We would prefer that it was a love seat. And we're like, God, you can totally have that, but just scoot over a little bit. Right? I mean, there's room. I mean, you're number one, but like I also just need a little bit of room here for TV. And we know that's not more important than you, but I spend way more time with it than you. So just scoot over a little bit. And God's like, I'm the creator of the world. I don't watch HGTV. Right? That's garbage. God doesn't care what Chip and Joanna do. He's. I don't know if you're like me. I feel like Chip and Joanna are the devil because they are like a wedge in my marriage. My wife will be like, Chip did this, Chip and Joanna did this. And I'm like, And my wife doesn't sound like that, but that's how it feels. But so many times we want God to just like scoot over on the love seat for sports, for our career, for whatever it is that we're also focused on. And when these good things that God gives us to enjoy and derive pleasure from in life try to share space, when we try to make it equal, God's saying he's not there. He doesn't sit on that kind of seat. We don't want to choose, but he's saying we must choose. And so as we go back to the story here in 1 Kings 18, the stage is set. The people are there. You have Elijah on one side, and you have 850 prophets of these false gods on the other side, and they're about to throw down. And you could sense the excitement in the moment, like the people would have started like a spiritual wave of just like, this is going to be awesome to watch what happens in this moment. And so here's what happens. Elijah, verse 25 says, choose, he says this to the prophets, choose one of the bulls and prepare it first, since there are so many of you. Call on the name of your God, but do not light the fire. Elijah says, hey, you go first. You get home court advantage. Ball's in your court. I mean, there's so many of you. This will be super easy. So here's what we're going to do. Here's the challenge. Build an altar and put upon it a bull, and then whoever's God shows up and consumes that with fire, that's who wins. But you and I, we can't light that fire. The gods we worship have to do it. And so here in verse 26, they, being those prophets, they took the bull given them and prepared it. Then they called on the name of Baal from morning till noon. Oh, Baal, answer us, they shouted. But there was no response. No one answered. And they danced around the altar that they had made. At noon, Elijah began to taunt them. Elijah starts talking trash. I love this moment. Shout louder, he said. Surely he is God. Perhaps he's deep in thought or busy or traveling. Maybe he's sleeping and needs to be awakened. In fact, this translation kind of plays it softly. Part of what Elijah actually said is, hey, maybe your God's just busy relieving himself, like he's in the bathroom and just needs you to wait for a second. Totally dog them in front of everybody. And in verse 28, so they shouted louder. They slashed themselves with swords and spears, as was their custom, until their blood flowed. Midday passed, and they continued their frantic prophesying until the time for the evening sacrifice. But there was no response. No one answered. No one paid attention. What started as a prayer became an all-day long frenzy. What started as like a hope became desperate. Their attention, their worship, their hopes were in something that was not showing up, was not delivering them. And they are dancing. They're doing everything they can in their power. And they're realizing this whole thing was an imitation. This whole thing can't do what we had hoped it could do in our lives. And that's the third step for every one of us. It's to realize that these idols, realize they're imitations. Realize that while they're amazing gifts, they are not God. And if we look to them to be anything other than a gift, they will disappoint. They will fall short. They cannot make you more whole or healthier or sexier or fulfilled. They cannot bring real contentment in life, not a contentment that is sustained. And our instinct is to think how primitive these people, cutting themselves and running around altars all day. That is just silly. And yet I think you and I have totally bled for some of these idols in our lives. I think you and I have bled. We have sacrificed for the pleasures, the idols of pleasures that have affected our families, our reputations, perhaps our careers. I think every one of us can relate with something where there's been too much focus on this and it has hurt something else because we sacrifice too. It just looks differently. You know, some of you maybe perhaps have bled for the pleasure of alcohol in your life. And I always think of the quote that's attributed to Benjamin Franklin. Who knows if he actually said it, but that beer is proof that God loves us. An example of a gift that's given and yet so often abused and misused and causes destruction. In fact, some of you, in me even mentioning beer as a good gift, might feel uncomfortable because you've seen the destruction of it in a loved one, or perhaps you've experienced it in your own life. But it's like everything. It's just something that gets abused. And too often when we think of these idols, we love to go to these extreme cases of like, oh, stuff like that and how it ruins families. But I think the far more important thing for you and I to realize and diagnose in our lives are the more subversive, subtle things that chip away at our relationship with God, things that we value and we pay a lot of attention to and we spend a lot of time with. And without realizing it, all of a sudden we end up in a place and we wonder how we got there. If you've ever been closer to God than you are right now, two things are very important for you to look at. One is, what are the idols, the focuses, the worships that have gotten you there, drifted from God? What are those things? And it's way easier than we often make it. How can you just go back to what you were doing before? In fact, that's where the story goes. Elijah, he steps up to take his turn. And it says first that he rebuilt an altar, meaning he went back to the stones and an altar of where they used to worship God and started right there where they used to. Just going back to like the first love kind of language. So he rebuilds this altar, and upon it he puts wood and then the bull. And then he digs a trench around the altar, and then he has them pour hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of gallons of water over the bull, soaking the wood and the altar and filling up the trench with water. He basically is saying, look, my God's going to beat your God with his hands tied behind his back. Saying, my daddy's bigger than your daddy. And so as these other prophets had been dancing and chanting all day long, pleading and cutting themselves, Elijah steps up and prays a very simple and humble prayer. Verse 36, it says, at the time of the sacrifice, the prophet Elijah stepped forward and prayed, Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel. He's reminding them of their identity as the people of God. Let it be known today that you are God in Israel and that I am your servant and have done all these things at your command. Answer me, Lord, answer me, so these people will know that you, Lord, are God and that you are turning their hearts back again. I love this because Elijah's goal, the whole point of this thing wasn't some just showdown. It was to point people back to the glory of the one who deserves it, to draw back, not to bring conviction upon those who have drifted and worshiped other things and been distracted, but to remind them of the great love and the great affection of the one who created you. Awesome moment. In verse 38, this is what happens. Then the fire of the Lord fell and burned up the sacrifice, the wood and the stones and the soil, and it licked up the water in the trench. When all of the people saw this, they fell prostrate and cried, the Lord, he is God. The Lord, he is God. God shows up. It wasn't much of a challenge, but he shows up. And in that moment, woke them out of the slumber, out of the distraction, and drew them back to him. And if that moment wasn't cool enough in the story, Elijah then points to the clouds that are rolling in, and rain returns to the land. And if God's power in that moment wasn't amazing enough, his love was ridiculous because in a tangible way, God literally poured out his love on his people that day saying like, I'm in control and I will provide and I will sustain. Just stay focused on me. Don't look to the bales of life to deliver what only I can. It's like his grace literally covered them, washed them, and reminded them of his great affection for them, though they had drifted. And this, I think, is the most important step for all of us, the fourth step, which is for you and I to refocus our affection, to refocus where we derive the greatest pleasure and value and meaning in life, to refocus our affection. I think this is so important, and to really set ourselves free of these things that distract us, is to learn that we, instead of trying to expel the idols that have a grip on our heart, instead of constantly trying to resist them, we just need to learn to replace them with a greater God, a greater affection, a greater love in our life. So often the things that keep tripping us up, we focus so much on them that it's like we give them power in our life. And instead of trying to resist them, God's inviting us just to get rid of them and replace them with him. In fact, let's do a little mental experiment right now to play with this idea. Everybody right now in your mind, as I'm talking, whatever you do, whatever I say, do not picture or think about snakes at all. Don't think about a black snake or a creepy crawly snake or how gardeners are kind of cute, but they smell funny when you pick them up and then they always pee. And don't think about a snake I heard got set free in here earlier and it could be under your seat right now. Do not think about snakes or cobras and how they do this. Don't picture snakes no matter what I say. How many of you right now, being honest, because you're in church, thought about snakes at least once for a second? And those of you who didn't, you can be proud of yourself, you're ruining it for me, but the rest of us get it. Now switch gears with me and picture grandma's apple pie. Picture the smell when you came in the house. I mean, you could smell the sugar on that thing when you came in the house, and that crispy, and it's hot, and it comes out of the oven, and the apples and the cinnamon and the just heavenliness of it. And then you take a scoop of vanilla bean ice cream and put it on top of there, and it begins to melt over it. And as you eat it, it's the perfect combination of cold and hot, and it's awesome. How many of you right now are thinking about snakes? It means you have a phobia, a real problem. The rest of us, we're thinking about apple pie. And it's so simple. We make it so complicated, but it's so simple Too often we focus so much on the bad and what we shouldn't do and the things that trip us up, and we forget just to focus on the one who created us, loves us, has not asked us to earn it or deserve it, and he has not poured out the condemnation and the conviction we all feel we deserve. He just keeps inviting us back to him. He keeps pursuing us. He keeps loving us and pouring his grace out on us. And the invitation for us all is to refocus our affection, for you and I to find our greatest pleasure in life in him, the giver of every gift that we get. Psalms 37:4 says it this way: take delight in the Lord, find your pleasure, give your affection to him, and he will give you the desires of your heart. Jesus said, seek me first in my kingdom, and all these other things in life will be taken care of.